The roof of an international airport terminal came down on people in Pereira, Colombia this morning. 18 dead in that city alone, 2 more in Manizales, 20 structures collapsed in Cali, and the fault responsible was 66 miles beneath the surface, far too deep to leave a single crack in the ground. 34 million people in 4 countries felt it. Nobody saw a fault line, because there wasn't one to see. Colombia has lived through a smaller earthquake in these same mountains that killed more than 1,000 people, and tonight the question is why this one didn't, and what a torn plate 100 kilometers down has to do with the volcano that went to orange alert 9 days ago. One thing before we get into it: if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next debrief. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's break this down. Part 1, 7:34 in the morning. At 34 minutes and 28 seconds past 12, Universal Time on Monday the 10th of August 2026, the ground underneath Western Colombia broke. Locally it was 7:34 in the morning, school runs, coffee, the ordinary machinery of a Monday starting up across a country of 52 million people. And then, for somewhere between 40 and 90 seconds depending on where you were standing, the entire western third of South America began to move. The United States Geological Survey catalogued the event as US 6000 TJL2 and gave it a magnitude of 7.4. The epicenter sat within a few kilometers of a town called San Jose del Palmar in Choco Department, on the Pacific side of Colombia's western cordillera. San Jose del Palmar has a population of roughly 4,800 people. It is not a city. It is not a regional hub. It is a small town in one of the most remote departments in the country, about 280 kilometers, 174 miles, west of Bogotá. In Bogotá itself, 8 million people felt it arrive, not as a jolt, as a sway. Building alarms began sounding across the capital before most people had worked out what was happening, and within minutes the streets of the business districts were filling with office workers who had walked down stairwells in a building that would not stop moving. The city's mayor, Carlos Fernando Galán, confirmed later that buildings across Bogotá were showing cracking, but that no significant structural collapse had been reported in the capital. 200 kilometers to the west of Bogotá, in the mountains of Colombia's coffee country, it went differently. If you have never been, the Eje Cafetero, the coffee axis, is a corridor of steep green ridges running north to south through the central Cordillera, terraced with coffee farms and studded with mid-sized cities that grew up around the trade: Pereira, Manizales, Armenia. Somewhere between 3 and 4 million people live in the wider region. It is the most densely populated stretch of mountain country in Colombia, and almost all of it is built on slopes. Roads switch back on themselves. Neighborhoods sit on ridgelines with the ground falling away on both sides. It is beautiful, and it is a difficult place to build anything that has to survive being shaken. At Matecaña International Airport, in the city of Pereira, the passenger terminal partially collapsed. A section of the roof detached and came down over a zone of the building where several people were standing. Matecaña is not a minor airfield. It is one of the primary air links serving the entire coffee region, the corridor of mid-sized Andean cities that produces most of what the world drinks in the morning. And on Monday morning its terminal roof came apart while passengers were underneath it. By the middle of the day the numbers had started to come in, and they were the kind of numbers that arrive in fragments from different mayors in different cities, rather than as a single national figure. In Pereira, the mayor, Mauricio Salazar, confirmed 18 people killed, with an unknown number still trapped inside buildings that had come down. In Manizales, an hour and a half to the northeast, a 4-story building suffered a partial collapse, and the city's mayor, Jorge Eduardo Rojas, confirmed 2 dead. In Cali, Colombia's third largest city, the mayor, Alejandro Eder, reported that at least 20 structures had collapsed, with people trapped underneath the rubble. At least 20 dead. That was where the count stood as the first day ran out, and the ground was not finished. At 18 minutes and 10 seconds past 1, Universal Time, 44 minutes after the main event, a magnitude 5.0 struck 16 kilometers west of the same town, at a depth of 98.5 kilometers. A separate magnitude 4.6 was confirmed in the same region. Neither of those would ordinarily be newsworthy. In a landscape where the buildings have already been shaken loose and the slopes have already been destabilized, they are something else. Aftershocks do not need to be large to finish what a main shock started. They only need to arrive while the rubble is still settling and while rescuers are inside it. Now, hold that number, because in a moment I am going to tell you why it is the strangest thing about this entire event. The United States Geological Survey placed this earthquake at a depth of 107 kilometres, 66 miles, straight down. That is the number nobody led with. Every headline led with 7.4 because 7.4 is the number people understand. But 107 kilometres is the number that explains everything else that happened on Monday, and more importantly, everything that did not happen. At 107 kilometres, this earthquake did not break the surface. There is no fault scarp anywhere in Colombia from this event. No line torn across a road, no offset fence, no photograph of a crack running through a field. The rupture happened so far beneath the ground that it never reached it. Rescue teams flying over the epicentral region on Monday afternoon had nothing to follow, no visible signature to tell them where the worst shaking had been concentrated, which is a genuine operational problem that the survey itself flagged. At 107 kilometres, this earthquake also produced no tsunami. None. Not a small one. A magnitude 7.4, roughly 100 kilometres from the Pacific coast of South America, and the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center formally ruled out any threat within 21 minutes of the event. And at 107 kilometres, this earthquake was felt by roughly 34 million people across 4 separate countries, in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Panama, and across the border in Venezuela. Almost every single one of them described the same thing. Not a violent jolt, a long, slow, rolling motion, like standing on the deck of a boat. The survey assigned this event an orange alert on its pager scale, which is the second highest of 4 levels. Orange means, in the agency's own framing, that significant casualties are likely and that the damage is potentially widespread. It is the level that historically corresponds to disasters requiring a regional or national government response, and Colombia responded accordingly. President Gustavo Petro announced within hours that he would personally lead the relief effort from the offices of the National Unit for Disaster Risk Management, the body Colombians know as the UNGRD. It is worth understanding what that alert actually is, because it is not a human judgment call made by someone looking at photographs. PAGER stands for Prompt Assessment of Global Earthquakes for Response, and it is an automated system. Within minutes of a large earthquake anywhere on Earth, it takes the estimated shaking intensity, overlays it on a global population database, cross-references that against what is known about the local building stock and how those specific construction types have historically performed under shaking, and produces a probability distribution of how many people are likely to have died. It does this before anyone has reached the scene. It does it before, in many cases, anyone in the affected region has been able to make a phone call. It is one of the more quietly remarkable pieces of infrastructure in modern disaster response, and it is the reason a government in Bogotá can begin sizing a national response at 8 in the morning rather than at 4 in the afternoon. Sitting underneath that orange alert in the technical products the survey publishes alongside it was a probabilistic estimate that almost nobody quoted. The survey's modelling gave this earthquake roughly a 1 in 3 chance of ultimately killing more than 1,000 people. 1 in 3. More than 1,000. And on day 1, the confirmed count was about 20. Now, I want to be very careful here, because that gap can be read 2 ways, and only one of them is honest. It does not mean the survey was wrong. It does not mean the disaster is over. As you will see later, there is an enormous part of this story that had not been counted yet on Monday, for reasons that have nothing to do with luck and everything to do with roads that no longer exist. The number 20 is a first-day figure from the places you can physically drive to. But even accounting for all of that, something genuinely unusual happened in Colombia on Monday morning. A magnitude 7.4 detonated underneath a populated region of the Andes, was felt by 34 million people, brought down an airport terminal, and killed a number of people that, in the grim arithmetic of earthquake disasters, is a fraction of what the magnitude alone would predict. Colombia knows exactly what the alternative looks like. This country has run this experiment before in almost exactly this region, with almost exactly this style of faulting. It happened in 1999, and when it did, it killed 1,185 people and left 160,000 homeless. That earthquake was a magnitude 6.2, substantially smaller, vastly deadlier. So what was different on Monday? The answer is not building codes, although those matter. It is not warning systems, because there were none. Nobody gets a warning for an earthquake directly beneath them. It is not luck. The answer is 90 kilometres of rock. Part 2. The Terminal at Matecaña. Let us start with the piece of this story you have almost certainly seen a photograph of, because it is the image that will define this earthquake in the public memory, and because it explains something important about how deep earthquakes actually cause harm. Matecaña International Airport sits on the western edge of Pereira, in Risaralda department, at an elevation of about 1,300 metres in the foothills of the Central Cordillera. It handles the traffic for a metropolitan area of around 700,000 people and functions as one of the main gateways into the Colombian coffee region, the Eje Cafetero, which is both an agricultural heartland and increasingly a tourist corridor. On Monday morning, part of the terminal came down. Reporting from the scene described a section of the passenger terminal partially collapsing, with a portion of the roof detaching over an area where several people were present. In the initial hours, no casualties were confirmed at the airport specifically, though the wording of those early reports carried the obvious caution of officials who did not yet know. What was immediately clear was that a primary regional air link had been structurally compromised in a country where, for a great many routes, flying is not a convenience but the only practical option. And Matecaña was not alone. Colombian reporting through Monday indicated that more than 10 airports across the affected region had been impacted, with operations suspended at Pereira, at Manizales, at Quibdó, at Armenia, at Cartago, and at Buenaventura. That is a significant slice of the country's regional aviation network taken offline in a single morning, including, and this matters enormously, the airports serving the two regions where help was most urgently needed. I want to dwell on one name in that list, because it is the one with the sharpest consequence attached to it. Quibdó is the capital of Choco, the department the earthquake happened underneath. Choco is not a place you drive into casually. Large parts of it have no paved road access at all. The terrain is dense Andean and Pacific rainforest, cut by rivers, and for a great many communities the practical options for reaching the outside world are a boat, a light aircraft, or a very long walk. When you suspend operations at Quibdó's airport, you are not inconveniencing business travellers. You are closing one of the few doors into a region that has almost no other doors, on the morning that region most needs them open. Every hour the airfield stays shut is an hour in which the department closest to the rupture becomes harder to assess and harder to help. That is the first appearance of a pattern that runs through this entire story, and it is worth naming now. The damage from this earthquake was not distributed by how hard the ground shook. It was distributed by what was standing on the ground, and by how easily anyone could get to it afterwards. In Manizales, the capital of Caldas department, a 4-story building suffered a partial collapse. Injuries were reported across the city, and the mayor, Jorge Eduardo Rojas, confirmed 2 deaths. Manizales is a city built along a knife-edge ridge in the Central Cordillera, one of the most vertically dramatic urban sites in South America, and a place where a great deal of the housing stock clings to slopes that were never especially comfortable to build on in the first place. In Pereira, 35 miles to the southwest, the toll was far worse. 18 dead, confirmed by Mayor Mauricio Salazar, with people still trapped in collapsed structures as the afternoon went on. In Cali, Colombia's 3rd city, with a metropolitan population of well over 2 million, Mayor Alejandro Ida reported at least 20 structures collapsed and people underneath them. Cali sits south of the epicenter, on the floor of the Cauca River Valley, and the figure of 20 collapsed buildings had not yet been resolved into a casualty count by the end of the first day. The geography of these 3 cities is not incidental, and it is going to matter later, so let me plant it now. Pereira, Manizales and Armenia sit in a cluster in the Central Cordillera, at altitudes between about 1,500 and 2,200 metres, on the ridges and slopes above the Cauca Valley. Cali sits on the valley floor itself. These are not cities built on flat, stable, uniform bedrock. They are cities built on mountain slopes, on old volcanic ash deposits, on river terraces, and on the loose sedimentary fill that accumulates at the bottom of a long valley between 2 mountain ranges. What the ground under a building is made of turns out to be one of the most powerful predictors of whether that building survives an earthquake, and in a landscape this varied, the ground can change character completely over the width of a single street. In Cundinamarca department, which wraps around Bogotá on the eastern side of the country, 2 buildings sustained structural damage, including a school in the municipality of Nilo. That is roughly 400 kilometres from the epicenter. Sit with that one for a second. 400 kilometres. That is the distance from London to Edinburgh, or from New York to Pittsburgh. A school building took structural damage from an earthquake whose epicenter was that far away, on the other side of two mountain ranges, and the earthquake in question was not a magnitude 9, it was a 7.4. There are shallow magnitude 7.4 events that would not have rattled a coffee cup at 400 kilometers. This one cracked a school, and in Armenia, in Quindio Department, damage was confirmed. Remember the name Armenia. We're going to come back to it, and when we do, it is going to reframe this entire event. Then there is Choco itself, the department where the earthquake actually happened. The governor of Choco, Nubia Carolina Cordoba Curie, confirmed injuries and building damage in the departmental capital Quibdó, and stated that emergency teams were carrying out an initial assessment with a fuller official report to follow. That statement is worth reading carefully because of what it does not contain. It contains no numbers, not because the governor was withholding them, but because on Monday afternoon they did not exist yet. We will come back to why. Colombia's National Unit for Disaster Risk Management confirmed it was in contact with local authorities across every affected department, working to verify damage and coordinate the relief response. Internationally, offers began arriving within hours. The Israeli Foreign Minister, Gideon Saar, publicly expressed solidarity with Colombia and indicated readiness to assist if required. So that is the damage map as it stood at the end of day 1. And I want you to look at the shape of it, because the shape is strange. The epicenter was in Choco, at a town of 4,800 people. The deaths were in Pereira and Manizales, cities on the other side of a mountain range, more than 100 kilometers away from the town the earthquake technically happened under. The collapsed structures were in Cali, further south again. The damaged school was in Cundinamarca, on the far side of the country. That is not how a shallow earthquake distributes its damage. A shallow earthquake writes its destruction in a tight ring around the epicenter and then fades quickly with distance. What happened on Monday was something else entirely, an event that touched 34 million people lightly and then reached out and destroyed specific structures in specific cities that had no particular claim to being close to it. There is a reason for that, and it is not random. It has to do with what 100 kilometers of rock does to an earthquake on its way up, which parts of it survive the journey and which parts do not. But before we get to the physics, we need to talk about the number that made all of it possible, because on Monday morning, 4 different scientific agencies looked at the same earthquake and could not agree on how deep it was. Part 3, the number nobody led with. Here is something that will sound like a problem and is actually just how science works in the first few hours of a disaster. The United States Geological Survey placed this earthquake at 107 kilometers depth, 66 miles. Colombia's own Servicio Geológico Colombiano, the National Geological Service, placed it at 96 kilometers, 60 miles. The European Mediterranean Seismological Center put it at 95 kilometers, 59 miles, and also disagreed on the magnitude, estimating 7.2 rather than 7.4, and the very first automated solution to come off the survey's own feed in the minutes after the event listed a depth of 110.285 kilometers, 4 agencies, 4 depths, a spread of about 15 kilometers. If you are inclined to see conspiracy in that, I understand the impulse, but there is nothing sinister here at all. Locating an earthquake means solving for 4 unknowns at once: latitude, longitude, depth, and origin time, from the arrival times of waves at seismometers scattered around the world. Depth is by far the hardest of the 4 to pin down, especially when the nearest stations are not directly above the rupture. Every agency uses a slightly different model of how fast seismic waves travel through the Earth's interior, a slightly different set of stations, and a slightly different weighting. As more data accumulates over the following hours and days, the solutions converge. This is routine. It happens after every large earthquake on the planet. The reason depth is the awkward one comes down to geometry. If your seismometers are all a long way from the rupture, the waves that reach them have travelled nearly horizontally, and shifting the source 10 kilometers up or down barely changes when they arrive. The trick seismologists use to get around this is to look for a second arrival, a wave that left the rupture heading upward, bounced off the underside of the Earth's surface directly above the source, and then set off toward the station. The delay between that bounced wave and the direct one is a very sensitive measure of how far the rupture sat below the surface, because the bounced wave has to make the round trip. When that phase is clearly recorded, depth gets pinned down tightly. When it is buried in noise, or when the network geometry is poor, you get the kind of 15-kilometre spread we saw on Monday morning. Nobody is guessing. They are all reading a slightly different portion of the same signal, and the signal takes time to fully arrive. And here is the thing. For the purposes of this story, the disagreement does not matter in the slightest, because all four agencies agree on the only thing that counts, somewhere between roughly 95 and 110 kilometres down. Seismologists divide earthquakes into three depth categories, and the boundaries are not arbitrary. Shallow earthquakes occur between the surface and about 70 kilometres. Intermediate depth earthquakes occur between 70 and 300 kilometres. Deep focus earthquakes occur between 300 and roughly 700 kilometres, which is about as deep as earthquakes get before the physics stops allowing them at all. Monday's earthquake was an intermediate depth event, comfortably, unambiguously, by every solution on the table. Now, why does that classification carry so much weight? Because almost every earthquake that has ever killed large numbers of people has been a shallow one. Think about the events that live in public memory. Haiti in 2010, 13 kilometres deep. The Indian Ocean earthquake in 2004, about 30 kilometres. Tohoku, Japan, in 2011, about 29 kilometres. These are all shallow events, and the reason they were catastrophic is not only their magnitude but their proximity. The rupture was essentially right there, underneath the buildings, with almost nothing in between. The mental picture most people carry of an earthquake is a shallow one, a crack in the ground, a fault line you could stand next to, the plates grinding past each other near the surface. That is a real thing, and it is the thing that kills. Monday's earthquake was not that. It happened inside the descending slab of oceanic plate that is sliding underneath Colombia, a slab of former seafloor that is now buried 100 kilometres beneath the Andes and is still, slowly, on its way down. Which brings us to the second strange thing about this event, and this one genuinely puzzled me when I first read the technical summary. The agencies attributed this earthquake to strike-slip faulting. Strike-slip means horizontal motion, two blocks of rock sliding past each other sideways, like the San Andreas does in California. The specific solution allowed for two possibilities that the data cannot yet distinguish between, either a northeast trending fault moving left laterally or a northwest trending fault moving right laterally. Those two options are mathematically identical from the seismic waves alone. Working out which one actually moved requires relocating the aftershocks over the following days and weeks, and that had not been done when this video was made. But here is why the strike-slip result is strange. When an earthquake happens inside a descending slab, the simplest thing you would expect is extension, the slab being pulled apart along the direction it is sinking, because the cold, dense leading edge of it is hanging down into the mantle, and the weight of that edge is stretching the plate behind it like a heavy coat pulling on its own hanger. That process is so common it has a name, slab pull, and it produces normal faulting, which is vertical stretching, not horizontal shearing. Slab pull is worth a moment on its own because it is one of the great underappreciated engines of the planet. Oceanic crust is born hot and buoyant at mid-ocean ridges, and as it spreads away from the ridge it cools, thickens and gets denser. Give it 100 million years and it becomes denser than the mantle underneath it. At that point it is no longer floating, it is waiting for somewhere to sink. When it finally starts to descend at a trench, the sinking is not something the plate is having done to it. The plate is falling, and it is dragging the rest of itself along behind. A significant fraction of all plate motion on Earth is driven by nothing more exotic than cold rock sinking because it is heavy. The slab under Colombia is doing that right now, in slow motion, and has been for tens of millions of years. So the expected earthquake inside a slab like that is the sound of something being stretched. Monday's was the sound of something being twisted instead. Monday's earthquake sheared sideways. Something down there is twisting the plate beneath Colombia rather than simply stretching it. Hold on to that, because in about 40 minutes I'm going to show you exactly what is doing the twisting, and it is one of the strangest structures in the entire South American subduction system. For now, though, the depth has one more immediate consequence, and it is a brutally practical one. Because the rupture happened 100 kilometers down, it produced no surface rupture whatsoever. There is no fault trace, nothing broke through to the air, and that means that when Colombian and international rescue teams began flying reconnaissance over the epicentral region, they had no visible line to follow. The survey explicitly noted this: The absence of surface rupture complicates the ability of rescue teams to map the most severely shaken zone from aerial observation alone. Think about what that means operationally. After a shallow earthquake, you can fly the fault. You can see where the ground tore, you can follow the scarp, and you can concentrate your search along the corridor where the shaking was worst, because the geometry tells you where it was. After a deep earthquake, you get none of that. You have a dot on a map with a depth attached to it, and a very large region around that dot where the damage could be anywhere, distributed by soil conditions and building types rather than by distance. So, a magnitude 7.4, 100 kilometers down, shearing sideways for reasons that do not fit the textbook, felt by 34 million people, with no scarp, no tsunami, and about 20 confirmed dead at the end of the first day. Every single one of those facts traces back to the depth. And Colombia, as it happens, has a control experiment. 27 years ago, in the same mountains, the same country ran the shallow version of this exact test. It did not go like this. Part 4, 1999. On the 25th of January 1999, at 19 minutes and 16 seconds past 1800 hours Universal Time, an earthquake struck the central Colombian Andes. Its magnitude was 6.2. By the standards of the numbers we have been throwing around, that is a modest event. It is not a headline magnitude. It is the kind of earthquake that happens somewhere on Earth every few days, and that most of the world never hears about. If you had shown a seismologist nothing but that number, and asked them to guess the consequences, they would have said, some damage, probably a handful of deaths, depending entirely on where it was. Where it was 17 kilometers beneath the coffee region, not 107. 17, directly underneath the densely built urban fabric of the same cluster of cities we have been talking about for the last half hour. The rupture occurred on an intraplate fault segment running parallel to the Andes, almost certainly part of the Romeral fault system, and the motion was left lateral strike slip, horizontal shearing, the same broad style of faulting as Monday's event. Same country, same mountains, same style of motion, roughly the same population living on top of it. 1,185 people died, more than 4,370 were injured, approximately 160,000 people were left without homes, and the city of Armenia, which at the time had a population of around 300,000, lost roughly 60% of its building stock to collapse or severe damage. 60%, not 60% damaged in some minor cosmetic sense. 60% of the buildings in a city of 300,000 people were either flattened or so badly compromised that they could not be used again. It was not the largest earthquake in Colombian history. It was, almost certainly, the most consequential in human terms, and it did what genuinely catastrophic disasters sometimes do to a country. It changed the law. The 1999 event drove a substantial reform of Colombian seismic building codes and of national earthquake policy, and a great deal of what has been built in the coffee region since then exists in the form it does because of what happened that January. The mechanics of that January afternoon are worth understanding, because they are the exact inverse of Monday. A magnitude 6.2 is a small rupture, a patch of fault perhaps 10 or 15 kilometers across, tearing for a handful of seconds. It released its energy into a volume of rock barely deeper than the height of 2 or 3 Andean ridges stacked on top of each other. There was no filtering. There was no thinning. The full spectrum of that earthquake, sharp high frequencies included, went straight up into the foundations of cities that sat almost directly on top of it, and it went in at the precise tempo that unreinforced masonry cannot survive. The buildings of Armenia were not asked to endure a lot of energy. They were asked to endure the specific kind of energy they were least equipped to handle, delivered from point-blank range, and the region's geology made it worse rather than better. The coffee region is built on thick deposits of volcanic ash, laid down over hundreds of thousands of years by the same arc of volcanoes we will come to shortly. Ash makes superb coffee soil. It makes very poor earthquake foundation. It is soft, it is loose, and it amplifies shaking rather than resisting it. A great deal of what fell in 1999 fell because of what it was standing on as much as because of how it was built. Now, let us put the two events side by side, because this is the comparison the entire story rests on. Monday's earthquake, magnitude 7.4. 1999, magnitude 6.2. The difference is 1.2 magnitude units. And here is the part that people consistently underestimate, because the magnitude scale is logarithmic in a way that is genuinely counterintuitive. Energy release does not scale with the magnitude number. It scales as 10 raised to the power of 1.5 times the difference in magnitude. 1.2 magnitude units times 1.5. That gives you 10 raised to the power of 1.8, which is approximately 63. Monday's earthquake released roughly 63 times more energy than the earthquake that killed 1,185 people in the same region 27 years earlier. 63 times the energy. And on its first day, it killed about 20. If that scaling still feels abstract, run it in the other direction, and it becomes very concrete very quickly. Monday's magnitude 7.4 against its own magnitude, 5.0 aftershock, is a difference of 2.4 magnitude units, which works out to roughly 4,000 times more energy in the main shock than in the aftershock that followed it 44 minutes later. And in the 7 days before Monday, the largest earthquake anywhere on the planet had been a magnitude 5.6. Monday's event released something like 500 times the energy of the previous week's global maximum. One earthquake, in one morning, outweighed everything the entire planet had managed in the preceding week by a factor of 500. This is also, incidentally, where a great deal of bad earthquake reporting goes wrong, and I want to flag it because you will see it. An automated briefing circulating on Monday stated that this event was roughly 63 times more energetic than a magnitude 5.6. That is wrong. Whoever wrote it took the magnitude difference and used it directly as the exponent instead of multiplying by 1.5 first. The correct figure against a 5.6 is about 500, not 63. 63 is the right number, but it belongs to a completely different comparison, the one against 1999. Two very different claims, one very small arithmetic slip, and the difference between them is a factor of 8. I want to be scrupulous here, because this comparison can be abused. The 20 is provisional, and it will rise. The 1999 figure of 1,185 is final, counted over months. The building stock in 1999 had not yet been through the code reforms that the disaster itself triggered. Armenia in 1999 took a direct hit. On Monday, Armenia was on the periphery and reported damage rather than devastation. All of that is true, and all of it matters. But none of it comes close to explaining a gap this size. You do not get from 1,185 to 20 on building codes alone, not in 27 years, not in a country where a great deal of the housing in the worst affected zone is still, by the United States Geological Survey's own assessment, mud wall with wood. Codes save lives at the margin. They do not absorb a 63-fold increase in released energy and turn a catastrophe into a bad news day. Something else did that, and the something else is not complicated. 17 kilometres versus 107 kilometres. 90 additional kilometres of solid rock between the place where the energy was released and the people standing on top of it. That is the whole thing. That is the entire difference between a disaster that reshapes a nation's building code and an event that, for the vast majority of the 34 million people who felt it, registered as a strange slow swaying that made the light fittings move. It is worth sitting inside how arbitrary that is. Nobody in Pereira did anything on Monday morning to earn a better outcome than the people of Armenia got in 1999. No decision was made. No preparation paid off in that particular way. The Nazca Plate happened to fail at 107 kilometres down rather than 17, and about 1,000 people who would otherwise be dead are tonight not. That is not comfort. It is the opposite of comfort once you follow it through. Because if depth is the variable that decides whether an earthquake is a news item or a national catastrophe, then the obvious question is what decides the depth, and whether Colombia can count on it. So, 90 kilometres of rock. What does rock actually do to an earthquake? Part 5. 100 kilometres of rock. 3 separate things happen to seismic energy on its way up through 100 kilometres of the Earth, and each of them removes a different portion of the destructive potential. Let us take them one at a time, because together they are the reason 20 people died instead of 1,000. The first is the simplest, and it is pure geometry. When a fault ruptures, it radiates energy outward in all directions, and that energy travels as an expanding wavefront. Picture a balloon inflating from the point of rupture. The total amount of energy in that wavefront is fixed. It is whatever the earthquake released. But the surface area of the balloon grows as it expands, and it does not grow gently. Surface area scales with the square of the radius. Double the distance the wave has travelled, and you have spread the same fixed quantity of energy over 4 times as much area. Triple it, and you are down to a ninth. Now apply that to 2 earthquakes. A rupture at 17 kilometers depth delivers its energy to the surface after 17 kilometers of expansion. It arrives concentrated, packed into a relatively small patch of ground directly above the source, which is precisely why shallow earthquakes are so vicious in a tight radius and fade so quickly beyond it. A rupture at 107 kilometers has to inflate that balloon more than 6 times further before any part of it touches a building. By the time it does, the energy arriving at any given square metre of ground has been thinned out enormously. Run the arithmetic and the scale of it becomes obvious. 107 divided by 17 is a little over 6. Square that, and you get something in the region of 40, purely from the geometry of an expanding wavefront, before you account for anything else that happens on the way. The energy arriving at a given patch of ground directly above Monday's rupture was already diluted by something on the order of 40 times, relative to the same earthquake at 1999's depth. That alone would take a great deal of the sting out of it. But it is not the biggest factor. The second thing is called anelastic attenuation, and it is the one that actually decides the outcome. Rock is not a perfect spring. When a seismic wave passes through it, the rock does not simply flex and return all the energy to the wave. A fraction of it is lost, converted into heat by internal friction, as mineral grains grind microscopically against each other. The wave is, very slowly, cooking the rock it passes through, and paying for the privilege out of its own amplitude. Here is the crucial part, and it is the thing that turns 100 kilometers of rock into a piece of safety equipment. That loss is not applied evenly across the wave. It preferentially eats high frequencies. The Earth, in other words, is a low-pass filter. High-frequency energy, the fast, sharp, short wavelength content, the part of an earthquake you would experience as a violent jolt, gets stripped out over distance. Low-frequency energy, the slow, long wavelength swaying, passes through relatively intact. The further the wave travels, the more thoroughly the sharp edges are sanded off it. You already know what this sounds like because you have heard it. Stand outside a building with loud music playing inside and you do not hear the music. You hear the bass. The high notes, the vocals, the cymbals, the detail are absorbed by the walls and the air, and what reaches you through 100 meters of brick and distance is the low end, thudding along on its own. The Earth does exactly the same thing to an earthquake, with 100 kilometers of rock playing the part of the wall. The people of the coffee region did not experience a magnitude 7.4 on Monday morning. They experienced the baseline of 1. Seismologists quantify how lossy a given piece of the Earth is with a number they call the quality factor. A high quality factor means rock that transmits waves efficiently and steals very little from them. A low quality factor means rock that absorbs greedily. Cold, dense, ancient rock tends to be efficient. Hot, fractured, partially molten rock is a sponge, and the path from a rupture at 100 kilometers depth up to the surface of an active mountain belt runs through some of the most thoroughly worked over material on the planet. The wedge of mantle above a descending slab, which is hot, chemically altered by fluids driven off the sinking plate, and in places carrying pockets of melt on its way to feeding volcanoes. It is, in other words, an unusually absorbent 100 kilometers, and high frequency is what kills ordinary buildings. To understand why, you have to think about what a building is mechanically. A small, stiff, low-rise structure, a single-story masonry house, a 2-story brick shop, an adobe or mud wall dwelling, is rigid. It does not want to bend. It has a short natural period, which means that if you push it and let go, it snaps back and forth quickly. Energy delivered at that quick tempo matches it perfectly, drives it hard and cracks it apart. That is the frequency band that flattens villages. An earthquake at 17 kilometers delivers that band directly into the buildings above it, undiminished. An earthquake at 107 kilometers has already had most of it removed before the wave reaches the bottom of the foundations. The third factor is the one nobody outside seismology thinks about, and it is the absence of an entire category of destruction. Shallow earthquakes do not only shake the ground, they break it. They produce a set of near-fault effects that simply do not exist at depth. There is rupture directivity, where the fault tears in a particular direction and focuses a great pulse of energy ahead of itself, the way a speeding boat piles up water at its bow. Communities in the path of that pulse can experience shaking far more severe than their distance from the epicenter would suggest. There is fling step, the permanent sudden offset of the ground itself as one side of the fault moves relative to the other. There is the physical tearing of the surface, which destroys everything crossing it: roads, pipelines, rail, water mains, foundations that happen to straddle the line. None of that happened in Colombia on Monday. It could not. There is no fault trace because the fault never reached the surface. There is no directivity pulse arriving at a village because the rupture was 100 kilometers below any village. There is no fling step because the ground did not permanently move anywhere. Put the three together and you can describe quite precisely what actually arrived in the coffee region on Monday morning. Energy that had been thinned by geometric spreading over more than 100 kilometers of expansion. Energy that had been filtered with its most destructive frequency band substantially removed. An energy arriving without any of the near-fault phenomena that make shallow earthquakes so specifically lethal. What is left, after all that, is a long, slow, rolling motion. There is a useful way to feel the difference. A shallow earthquake underneath you is a percussive event. It is a hammer blow transmitted through the ground, and the human body registers it as violence. A bang, a lurch, objects thrown rather than slid. A deep earthquake 100 kilometers down is not percussive at all. It is closer to being at sea. The floor does not hit you. It tilts, holds, and tilts back, over and over, for a length of time that is genuinely disturbing precisely because it will not stop. People describe nausea. They describe watching a hanging light trace a slow circle. They describe reaching for a wall that is moving in the opposite direction to the one they expected. It is deeply unpleasant and for most ordinary buildings survivable, which is exactly what everybody said. Go back and read the witness descriptions from Monday, and the consistency is remarkable. In Choco, in Bogotá, in Quito, in Guayaquil, in Panama City, the same phrase keeps recurring. Long, rolling, not violent. People describing a swaying that went on and on rather than a bang. That is not a coincidence of language across 4 countries. That is 34 million people independently describing the output of a 100-kilometer low-pass filter, and none of them knowing that was what they were describing. The mountain of rock between the rupture and the coffee region did work that no building code could have done. It performed a service that engineering can only approximate for free by accident because of where a plate happened to break. But, and this is where the story turns, a low-pass filter does not remove everything. It removes the high frequencies, the low frequencies come through, and something in Colombia was listening for exactly those. Part 6. What survives? The trip. Every structure has a natural period. It is one of the most useful ideas in all of engineering, and one of the easiest to feel intuitively, because you have already experienced it. Think about pushing a child on a swing. There is exactly one rhythm that works. Push at that rhythm and each push adds to the last, and the swing goes higher and higher with very little effort from you. Push faster or slower than that rhythm, and you are fighting the swing. Your pushes cancel out and nothing much happens. The swing has a natural period, and it responds enormously to energy delivered at that period and hardly at all to energy delivered at any other. Buildings work the same way. Every structure has a rhythm at which it wants to sway, set by its height, its mass, and its stiffness. And when seismic energy arrives at that rhythm, the building does not simply absorb it, it accumulates it. Each cycle adds to the last. The motion grows. Short, stiff, low-rise buildings have short natural periods. They want to be pushed quickly. Tall buildings, long-span roofs and bridges have long natural periods. They want to be pushed slowly. A 20-story tower can take several seconds to complete a single sway. Engineers carry a rough rule of thumb for this that is accurate enough to be useful. A building's natural period in seconds is somewhere around 1/10 of its number of stories. A single-story house wants to be shaken about 10 times a second. A 4-story building wants a rhythm closer to 2.5 times a second. A 20-story tower wants to be pushed roughly once every 2 seconds. Those are wildly different tempos, and an earthquake does not deliver all of them equally. It delivers whatever survived the trip. Now put those two facts together, the filtering and the resonance, and Monday's damage pattern stops being mysterious and becomes almost predictable. The 100 kilometers of rock removed the short-period energy. That is the energy that destroys small, stiff, low-rise structures. So the villages of Choco, built largely of mud wall and wood, did not receive the frequency band that is specifically lethal to mud wall and wood. But the long-period energy came through unfiltered, and the long-period energy is exactly what tall buildings, wide-span roofs and bridges are tuned to. Look at what actually failed on Monday. An airport terminal roof, a long-span structure, that is the entire architectural point of a terminal, a wide clear space unobstructed by columns, which necessarily means a roof spanning a long distance with a correspondingly long natural period. Think about what a terminal building is being asked to do structurally. The architectural requirement is an uninterrupted floor area big enough to move thousands of people through, with sight lines across the whole space and as few columns as possible getting in the way. Every column you remove means the roof has to span further under its own weight, which means longer beams or trusses, which means more flexibility and a longer natural period. The very features that make a terminal usable as a terminal are the features that make its roof responsive to slow shaking. And unlike a wall, a roof has nowhere to fail to accept downward onto whatever is underneath it. In Pereira on Monday morning, what was underneath it was people. A 4-story building in Manizales, mid-rise, squarely in the responsive band, 20 structures in Cali, on the floor of the Cauca Valley, a school in Cundinamarca, 400 kilometers away. None of these are at the epicenter. Every one of them is the kind of structure that responds to slow shaking. This is not coincidence, and it is not bad luck. This is a 100-kilometer deep earthquake selecting its targets by frequency, and it selected them across 400 kilometers of Colombia with a consistency that ought to be unsettling. There is one more layer, and it is the reason the valley cities took it badly. Seismic waves change character, depending on what they travel through in the final few hundred meters before they reach a building. Hard bedrock transmits shaking more or less faithfully. Soft sediment does something different. It amplifies. A wave entering a basin of loose sediment slows down, and because it must carry the same energy at lower speed, its amplitude grows. Worse, sedimentary basins have natural periods of their own, and those periods tend to be long, which means a soft valley floor selectively amplifies precisely the slow, long-period shaking that a deep earthquake delivers. Pereira, Manizales and Armenia sit on ridges and slopes of old volcanic ash and river terraces. Cali sits on the sediment fill of the Cauca Valley. These are not places where the ground is neutral. In an event dominated by long-period energy, those settings are amplifiers wired directly into the frequency band that is arriving. The world already has a textbook case of this, and it is one of the most instructive disasters of the 20th century. In 1985, a great earthquake ruptured off Mexico's Pacific coast in the state of Michoacán. Mexico City is hundreds of kilometers inland from that coast, far enough that, on the raw physics of distance alone, it should have received a moderate shaking and little else. What happened instead was that the city's historic centre, built on the soft clay of a drained lake bed, resonated. The basin took the long-period energy that had survived the journey and amplified it enormously, and then it delivered that amplified energy at a rhythm that matched a very specific range of building heights. Mid-rise buildings, roughly 6 to 15 stories, came down across the city. Taller ones frequently survived. Shorter ones frequently survived. The earthquake reached inland for hundreds of kilometers, found the buildings whose natural period matched what the lake bed was serving, and destroyed those and largely those alone. Nobody in Mexico City in 1985 was near the fault. That is the point. Distance from the rupture is a poor predictor of who dies. What you're standing on and what shape your building is are far better ones. 2 days ago, in the video on Mount Rainier, the argument was that the most dangerous thing about a volcano is not always the thing you are watching for. That a mountain can produce a catastrophe through a mechanism that has nothing to do with erupting. This is the same shape of lesson, in a different discipline. The most dangerous property of an earthquake is not always its magnitude. On Monday it was its frequency content, and the frequency content was set by depth. So let us be precise about what we are claiming, because I do not want to leave you with the wrong impression. Deep earthquakes are not harmless. 20 people are dead, an airport is broken, buildings came down in 3 separate cities. What deep earthquakes are is selectively harmful, and they select differently than shallow ones. A shallow earthquake destroys a small area comprehensively. A deep earthquake reaches across an entire country and destroys specific things, chosen by what they are made of and how they are shaped and what they are standing on, at distances that feel impossible. Here is a contrast that makes the point from the other direction. Within the same 24 hours as the Colombian event, 2 other earthquakes occurred on this planet that were far shallower. A magnitude 5.5 in the east-central Pacific Ocean at 10 kilometers depth. A magnitude 5.0 on the northern mid-Atlantic ridge, also at 10 kilometers. Both of them were shallow in exactly the way that makes earthquakes dangerous. Both delivered their full high-frequency content essentially undiminished to whatever was above them. Neither was felt by a single human being. Both were under open ocean, thousands of kilometers from the nearest person. So location matters, depth matters more, and magnitude, taken by itself with no other information attached, matters least of the 3, which is a genuinely strange thing to say about the only number most people ever learn about an earthquake. Which brings us finally to the question this whole video has been circling, the depth saved somewhere between hundreds and 1,000 lives in Colombia on Monday. That is not speculation. That is what the comparison with 1999 tells you. So why was it that deep? Why did the Nazca Plate fail at 107 kilometers beneath Choco and not at 17 kilometers beneath Pereira? The answer is that the plate underneath Colombia is not sinking in one piece. It is torn. Part 7. 34 million people. Before we go underground, I want to give you the scale of what happened at the surface, because the number is genuinely difficult to hold in your head. The United States Geological Survey estimated that approximately 34.4 million people felt this earthquake. Not 34 million people in the affected region. 34 million people who physically experienced ground motion from a single rupture in a single morning across 4 sovereign countries: Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, and Venezuela. For comparison, that is roughly the population of Canada. It is more people than live in Australia and New Zealand combined. One fault, 100 kilometers beneath a town of 4,800 people, moved the ground under a population the size of a large developed nation. The survey breaks that exposure down by shaking intensity, and the ladder is worth walking rung by rung, because each level describes a genuinely different human experience. A word on what intensity actually is, because it is routinely confused with magnitude, and the two are not the same kind of thing at all. Magnitude is a property of the earthquake, one number for the whole event, describing how much energy was released at the source. Intensity is a property of a place. It describes what the shaking was actually like where you were standing, and a single earthquake has as many intensity values as there are locations to measure. The scale is descriptive rather than instrumental in origin. It was built by asking what happened to people, to furniture, and to buildings, and then codifying the answers. That is why intensity descriptions sound less like physics and more like witness statements. They are witness statements, organized. At the top, 1.9 million people experienced what the intensity scale classifies as very strong shaking. Very strong is the level at which standing becomes difficult. Furniture moves, unsecured objects fall from shelves, plaster cracks. Poorly built structures sustain moderate damage, and badly built ones can begin to fail outright. Almost 2 million people were in that band. Below that, 14 million people experienced strong shaking. At that level, everybody feels it. Everybody knows exactly what it is, and people go outside. Dishes break, windows rattle, unstable objects overturn. Damage is generally slight in well-built structures and noticeable in poorly built ones. Below that, 12.9 million people experience moderate shaking, felt by everyone indoors, felt by many outdoors, unmistakable, alarming, but rarely damaging. And at the bottom, 5.6 million people experience light shaking, enough to be noticed, enough to make hanging objects swing, not enough to do anything. Add those together, and you get the 34.4 million. Now, here is the thing about that distribution that I find genuinely remarkable. Look at the shape of it. Only about 5.5% of the exposed population was in the very strong band. The overwhelming majority, 27.5 million people out of 34, were in moderate or light. That is the signature of a deep earthquake written in demographics rather than physics. A shallow magnitude 7.4 produces an inverted version of that pyramid, a much smaller total exposed population, but with a far higher proportion of them in the severe bands, because the energy is concentrated rather than spread. Monday's event traded intensity for reach. It gave up the ability to destroy any single place comprehensively in exchange for the ability to touch a third of a continent. You can see that trade in the international reports. In Ecuador, residents across the country reported the shaking. In Quito, in Guayaquil, in Puerto Viejo, in Otavalo, in Chone, in Sangolquí, in Atuntaqui. These are cities spread across the entire width and length of the country, from the Andean highlands to the Pacific coastal plain. And in every one of them, the description was the same: long, rolling, and not violent. No emergencies were reported anywhere in Ecuador. In Panama, civil protection crews began checking for damage across the interior of the country and issued a very specific piece of advice to residents of high-rise buildings. Use the stairs, not the elevators. That advice tells you something. It is not the advice you give when you think buildings might collapse. It is the advice you give when you think elevator mechanisms may have been jolted out of alignment, or when power may be unstable. The response of a country that felt something significant and is being careful rather than a country in crisis. In Venezuela, tremors were felt across the border, in a country that was, at that moment, still burying its own dead from a separate catastrophe 7 weeks earlier. We will come back to that. And in Bogotá, 8 million people, the political and economic centre of the country, 400 kilometres from the rupture, alarms sounded, buildings swayed, and the working population of an entire capital city walked down stairwells into the street. Mayor Carlos Fernando Galán confirmed cracking across the city's building stock and no significant structural collapse. Cracking in 8 million people's worth of buildings from 400 kilometres away. There is one more number in the survey's assessment, and it is the one that quietly reframes the whole event. The agency estimated the total economic losses from this earthquake at below 1% of Colombia's gross domestic product. On the face of it, that reads like good news. Read it again, and it is something darker. The financial exposure is low because the region that took the worst of the shaking does not have much, in monetary terms, to lose. The survey's own product notes what the buildings in the most severely shaken zone are made of. The predominant construction types, in its phrasing, are mud wall with wood, and unknown or miscellaneous. Mud wall with wood is the most vulnerable category of construction that exists. It is what a very large number of people in rural Choco live inside. It costs almost nothing to replace, which is why the economic loss figure stays small, and it offers almost no protection, which is why the human figure may not. It is worth being precise about why that kind of building fails, because it is not merely that it is cheap. Earth-walled construction is strong in compression and almost worthless in tension. A wall of packed earth will happily hold up a roof for a century, because holding up a roof means being squeezed, and squeezing is what it is good at. But shake it sideways and you ask the wall to resist being pulled apart, and there is nothing inside it to resist with. No steel, no reinforcement, often not even a continuous timber ring beam tying the tops of the walls together. The wall cracks vertically, the corners separate, the roof loses its support on one side, and the whole thing comes down inward on whoever is inside. It happens in seconds. It is the single most reliable killer in earthquakes worldwide, and it is why 2 events of identical magnitude can produce death tolls 3 orders of magnitude apart depending on nothing more than what the local houses are made of. The one mercy on Monday, and it is a real one, is that the specific frequency band that destroys those walls is the band that 100 kilometres of rock had already largely removed. That is the tension sitting underneath the whole event. The low economic number and the potentially high human number are not in contradiction. They are the same fact stated in 2 different currencies. So the shaking reached 34 million people across 4 countries and did comparatively little to the vast majority of them. But there is one thing: a magnitude 7.4, 100 kilometres from the Pacific coast of South America, conspicuously did not do at all, and its absence is as diagnostic as anything else about this event. Part 8. The Ocean That Didn't Move. There was no tsunami, not a small one, not a local one, not a marine advisory that quietly expired a few hours later. The United States Geological Survey's event record carried a tsunami flag of 0, and at 55 minutes past 12, Universal Time, 21 minutes after the rupture, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center formally ruled out any tsunami threat from the event. No coastal evacuation orders were issued anywhere in Colombia, Ecuador, or Panama. I want to be careful with one detail here, because it is the kind of thing that gets misread and then spreads. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's tsunami feed did contain a single Colombia bulletin, updated at 58 minutes past 12 Universal Time. It carried coordinates near the epicenter, and in the raw data as it came through, its summary field was empty, no warning level specified. That is not a tsunami warning. It is an informational product of the kind automatically generated for any large earthquake near a coastline, saying in effect, "We have looked at this. Here is the event." Read carelessly, an empty bulletin with no stated level looks like a mystery or an omission. It is neither. The tsunami flag was 0. The warning center's statement was explicit, and no threat existed at any point. But it is worth asking why, because the answer is the same answer as everything else in this story. Tsunamis are not caused by shaking. This is the single most common misconception about them. A tsunami is caused by the sudden vertical displacement of the seafloor, the ocean bottom lurching upward or dropping downward, taking the entire column of water above it with it. That displaced water then does what displaced water does. It collapses back down and radiates outward as a wave carrying the energy of the whole water column, not just the surface. That mechanism requires two things. It requires vertical motion, and it requires that motion to happen close enough to the seafloor to actually move it. Monday's earthquake had neither, and this is why the warning centre was able to rule it out in 21 minutes, which on the face of it sounds impossibly fast for a decision with that many lives attached to it. It is fast because it does not require waiting to see whether a wave appears. The centre already has the magnitude, the location, the depth, and a preliminary sense of the mechanism within minutes, and those 4 numbers are very nearly sufficient on their own. A shallow thrust event on a plate interface under the ocean triggers an immediate warning posture. A deep intraslab event under land with horizontal motion does not. The tide gauges and the deep ocean pressure sensors are there to confirm or correct that first judgment, but the first judgment is made from the earthquake itself. 21 minutes is not the centre rushing, it is the centre finishing. The motion was strike-slip, horizontal shearing, 2 blocks of rock sliding past each other sideways. Sideways motion does not lift a water column. Even at shallow depth, pure strike-slip events are famously poor tsunami generators for exactly this reason. Slide 1 block of the seafloor horizontally past another, and the water above simply flows around the disturbance. Nothing has been raised, so nothing has to fall back down. There is no potential energy stored anywhere. Strike-slip earthquakes under the sea do occasionally produce local waves, but almost always indirectly, by shaking a steep underwater slope loose and triggering a submarine landslide, which then does the vertical displacement the earthquake itself failed to provide, and the rupture was 107 kilometers down. Even if the motion had been vertical, at that depth, the deformation reaching the seafloor above would have been a broad, gentle, almost imperceptible flexing spread across a vast area, rather than the sharp local step that launches a wave. Compare that to the events that do generate tsunamis. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake ruptured at roughly 30 kilometers depth on the interface between 2 plates, with enormous vertical motion. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake off Japan ruptured at roughly 29 kilometers, again on the plate interface, again with massive vertical displacement. In places the seafloor moved tens of meters. Those are shallow, interface thrust events. That is the recipe. Monday's was deep, intraslab, and strike-slip. It was, in tsunami terms, close to the least dangerous configuration a magnitude 7.4 can adopt. Earlier this month, in the video on the Kuril and Kamchatka arc, this same distinction did the heavy lifting. A cluster of earthquakes appeared in a subduction zone, and the question was whether they meant anything for the plate interface, and the answer turned on depth, because events inside a descending slab and events on the boundary between 2 plates are fundamentally different animals even when their magnitudes look identical on a list. Same principle here. A 7.4 is not a 7.4 is not a 7.4. Where it happens in the system determines almost everything about what it does, which raises an uncomfortable point that the absence of a tsunami should not be allowed to obscure. The plate boundary off Colombia's coast is entirely capable of the other kind of earthquake. In 1906, a rupture on this same boundary, the interface where the Nazca Plate meets South America, produced an event estimated at magnitude 8.8. That is one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded anywhere, and it generated a tsunami that crossed the Pacific. Further south along the same margin, the 2010 Chile earthquake, Also on the Nazca South America interface was also a magnitude 8.8. The difference in scale between that and Monday is worth stating, because the magnitude numbers make it look smaller than it is. 8.8 against 7.4 is a gap of 1.4 magnitude units, which by the same energy relation we used earlier, works out to something on the order of 125 times more energy. The 1906 event was not a somewhat larger version of Monday. It was a fundamentally different category of occurrence, on a fault surface hundreds of kilometers long, at shallow depth, on the boundary between plates, displacing the seafloor vertically over an enormous area. Every ingredient Monday's earthquake conspicuously lacked, present at once. The boundary can do it. It has done it. It will do it again. Monday's event simply was not that. It did not happen on the boundary between the plates. It happened inside one of them, 100 kilometers down, in the interior of a slab of ancient seafloor that is on its way toward the mantle, which forces the question this entire video has been building toward, and which the next hour is going to answer. What exactly is that slab doing down there? Because the standard picture, a clean sheet of oceanic plate bending downward and sliding smoothly under a continent, does not produce strike-slip earthquakes at 107 kilometers. It does not produce a band of intermediate depth seismicity in one part of a country and near silence in another. And it does not explain why Colombia's volcanoes stop abruptly along a line. The plate beneath Colombia is not descending in one piece. It is torn in half. Part 9. The Tear. Everything strange about Monday resolves if you know one thing about the plate underneath Colombia. So let me show you the thing. Somewhere between 5 and 5.6 degrees north, a line running roughly east to west across the country, the Nazca plate is ripped. The structure has a name. It is called the Caldas Tear. It runs for approximately 240 kilometers, striking west to east, and across it the subducting plate is offset by roughly 240 kilometers in an east-west direction. That is not a crack. That is not a fracture zone in the ordinary sense. That is a piece of tectonic plate that has been torn apart and displaced by a distance greater than the length of Wales. And the two halves behave completely differently. North of roughly 5.4 degrees, the plate subducts shallowly. It goes down at an angle of only 20 to 30 degrees. A shallow, flattened descent, running for a long horizontal distance before it gets anywhere deep. This is the segment adjacent to the Panama Arc, and we will come to why that matters in a moment. South of roughly 5.4 degrees, down to about 3 degrees north, the plate subducts normally. It goes down at 30 to 40 degrees, a steeper, more conventional descent of the kind you would find in most subduction zones around the world. One plate, two completely different dip angles, separated by a tear. It is worth pausing on what a torn slab actually looks like, because the word tear invites the wrong mental image. This is not a clean cut with a gap you could see. Nothing is missing. What you have is a discontinuity, a boundary in the descending plate across which the geometry changes abruptly rather than gradually. On one side, the slab occupies one set of depths beneath a given point on the map. On the other side, it occupies a completely different set. Between them is a zone of intensely deformed rock where the plate has had to accommodate being pulled in two directions at once. In some torn subduction systems, the two halves separate enough that hot mantle flows up through the opening. Geologists call that a slab window, and where they occur they leave a distinctive chemical fingerprint in the volcanic rocks above. Whether or not the Caldas structure has opened that far, the essential picture holds. The plate beneath Colombia is not one thing behaving one way. It is two things, behaving differently, joined along a line of damage. Now, if you have a slab that descends steeply, it reaches intermediate depths relatively close to the coast, and if that slab is under stress, that is where its earthquakes will happen. And that is precisely what the seismicity shows. Within the southern segment, earthquake relocation studies have identified a concentrated band of intermediate depth seismicity known as the Cauca cluster. It sits between 3.6 and 5.2 degrees north, in the depth range of 50 to 300 kilometers. Tomographic imaging describes it as a slab roughly 15 kilometers thick, dipping toward the southeast, with the dip angle steepening progressively from about 20 degrees at the northern edge of the cluster to about 38 degrees at the southern edge. Read that last detail again, because it is the important one. The dip is not constant across the cluster. It changes, steadily, continuously, from north to south. The slab is not merely torn, it is being progressively bent along its length, twisted from one geometry into another across a horizontal distance of not much more than 150 kilometres. Now let us put Monday's earthquake on that map. Latitude, 4.88 degrees north. Depth, approximately 107 kilometres. That is inside the Cauca cluster. It is in the southern segment, in the steeply dipping half, at a depth squarely in the middle of the band where that segment produces its earthquakes, and it is close to the northern boundary of the cluster, close in other words to the tear itself. This earthquake did not happen in a random place. It happened in the single most seismically distinctive volume of rock in the entire country, in exactly the depth range that volume is known for. And that is not a small claim, so let me make clear what it rests on. The Cauca cluster is not a pattern somebody noticed on a map of raw earthquake locations. Raw catalogue locations are too scattered to reveal structure of this kind, because each individual event carries its own error bars in 3 dimensions. What produces a picture this sharp is relocation, taking thousands of earthquakes recorded over decades and solving for their positions relative to each other rather than independently, which cancels out much of the shared error introduced by the velocity model. Do that, and a smear of dots collapses into a surface, a 15-kilometre thick sheet dipping southeast, bending as it goes. What you're looking at in a relocated catalogue like that is a photograph of a plate taken with earthquakes instead of light. And there is a detail here that borders on the uncomfortable. The tear is named for Caldas, the Colombian department it runs beneath. The capital of Caldas is Manizales. Manizales is one of the 2 cities where people died on Monday morning. I do not want to make that sound like fate, because it is not. The naming is a geographical convenience and nothing more, but it is a genuinely strange thing to sit with. The structure that controls where Colombia's deep earthquakes happen carries the name of the department whose capital lost people to one. Now, the mechanism. Remember the puzzle from earlier. This earthquake was strike slip, horizontal shearing at 107 kilometres in a slab where the textbook expectation is vertical stretching from slab pull. Look at what we have just described and the puzzle dissolves. You have a plate that has been torn along a 240-kilometre line. You have an offset of 240 kilometres across that tear. You have one half descending at 20 to 30 degrees and the other at 30 to 40. And you have the dip angle changing continuously along the length of the southern segment, from 20 degrees to 38. A plate in that configuration is not being cleanly stretched. It is being sheared. Different parts of it are moving in different directions at different angles, and the material caught between those parts has to accommodate the mismatch somehow. Horizontal shear is exactly what that produces, and horizontal shear produces strike-slip earthquakes. The mechanism and the structure fit each other. There is a homely version of this that makes the geometry intuitive. Take a sheet of paper and push it down into a gap so that it curves. If you push the whole sheet uniformly, it bends smoothly, and the stresses inside it are simple. Now push one half of the sheet in at a shallower angle than the other. The sheet cannot accommodate 2 different curvatures at once across a continuous surface, so it buckles and tears along the line between them, and the material immediately either side of that line gets twisted, not merely bent. The Nazca plate is a sheet 100 kilometres thick being pushed into the earth at 2 different angles on either side of a line, and it has been doing so for millions of years. Twisting is not an exotic outcome of that arrangement, it is the expected one. I want to be honest about the limits of that claim, because this is the point in a video like this where it becomes tempting to overstate. What I have described is a well-motivated interpretation. It is consistent with the location, consistent with the depth, consistent with the mechanism, and consistent with decades of published work on the geometry of the northern Nazca slab. What it is not yet is a confirmed attribution for this specific rupture. Establishing that requires relocating the aftershocks over the coming weeks and refining the moment tensor, work that had not been published when this video was made. The agencies still disagree about the depth by more than 10 kilometres and about the magnitude by 2/10. Until that settles, the honest position is that this looks very much like tear-related deformation and has not been proven to be. But hold the framework in your head anyway, because of what it does to the central question. The tear is the reason the southern slab descends steeply. The steep descent is the reason it reaches 100 kilometres depth beneath western Colombia, rather than 1,000 kilometres inland. And 100 kilometres of depth is the reason 20 people died on Monday instead of 1,000. A rip in a plate tens of millions of years old decided the death toll of a Monday morning in 2026, which leaves one question outstanding. What tears a tectonic plate in half? Part 10. What Panama Did. The answer involves a country that most people would not immediately associate with Colombian earthquakes, and a collision that is still happening right now. To tear a plate, you need something extraordinary. Oceanic lithosphere is not fragile. It is a slab of rock up to 100 kilometers thick, cold, dense, and coherent enough to sink into the mantle as a single unit for thousands of kilometers. Ripping one apart across 240 kilometers requires a force applied over geological time and a weakness for that force to exploit. Colombia had both. The force is Panama. Not the country as a political entity, obviously, but the geological block underneath it, the Panama microplate, sometimes called the Panama Block. And the crucial fact about it is that it is not made of ordinary oceanic crust. It is built from the remains of an ancient volcanic island arc, a chain of volcanoes that grew above a subduction zone long ago, accumulated a thick pile of relatively light volcanic rock, and then went on moving with the plate that carried it. That distinction matters enormously because it determines whether something can sink. Subduction is fundamentally about density. Ordinary oceanic crust, as we discussed, is born hot and light at a mid-ocean ridge and then spends tens of millions of years cooling and thickening until it becomes denser than the mantle beneath it. At that point it is ready to sink, and when it reaches a trench, down it goes. That is the normal cycle. Ocean floor is manufactured, it ages, it becomes heavy, and it is recycled. Island arc crust does not follow that script. It is thick, it is chemically light, and it stays buoyant. It cannot sink. Push it toward a trench, and it will not go down. It will jam, and that is exactly what happened. The Panama Block collided with the northwestern corner of South America and could not subduct. It ran into the continent and stopped, and it has been pressing against it ever since. A slow-motion tectonic collision that is one of the defining features of the entire region, and which, incidentally, is a large part of why the Isthmus of Panama exists at all, why the Americas are joined, and why the Atlantic and Pacific were separated a few million years ago, with consequences for global ocean circulation and for the evolution of every animal on two continents. But the local consequence is the one we care about. When something buoyant jams into a continent, the deformation does not simply stop at the point of contact. It propagates outward, and in this case, the deformation from the Panama collision is understood to have ripped the adjacent Nazca Plate apart. Which brings us to the weakness. Plates do not tear in random places. They tear along lines that were already weak, old scars, healed fractures, ancient structures that never quite forgot they were once boundaries. And the Nazca Plate had one available, running in almost exactly the right orientation, a fossil spreading ridge known as the Sandra Rift. A spreading ridge is where oceanic crust is created. When one dies, when the spreading stops and the ridge is carried away as part of a plate, it leaves behind a linear zone of crust with a different thermal history, a different structure, and a different strength from the rock on either side of it. It is, in effect, a seam, and a seam is where a fabric tears first. So the sequence, in order, reads like this. An island arc that could not sink arrived at the edge of South America and jammed. The stress from that collision propagated into the neighbouring oceanic plate, and the neighbouring plate, rather than deforming uniformly, split along an old, dead spreading ridge that had been sitting inside it as a line of weakness for millions of years. Something arrived that could not go down, and the plate beside it tore along a scar it already had. Now here is the part that almost no coverage of this earthquake will reach, and it is the part that turns a geology lesson into the second half of tonight's story. The tear does not only control earthquakes. Look at where Colombia's volcanoes are. The published work on this structure is unambiguous. The Caldas tear creates an offset in the volcanic arc. North of the tear you find inactive magmatic bodies of late Miocene age or older, rocks that were once part of a volcanic system and have been dead for something like 6 to 10 million years. South of the tear you find quaternary magmatic activity, geologically recent and in a great many cases still going. Stated plainly, Colombia's active volcanoes exist only south of the tear. North of it, where the slab lies flat, the arc simply stops. And the reason is mechanical rather than mysterious. Arc volcanoes are fed by water. As a slab descends, it heats up, and the water bound into its minerals is driven off and rises into the mantle wedge above. Water dramatically lowers the melting point of hot rock, so the mantle above a descending slab partially melts, and that melt rises to build a chain of volcanoes at the surface. But this only works if the slab descends steeply enough to reach the right depth, beneath the right part of the overriding plate. Flatten the slab out, and it dehydrates in the wrong place. Too far inland, too shallow, under crust that is too thick and too cold, and no arc forms. South of the Caldas, tear the slab dips at 30 to 40 degrees, and Colombia has volcanoes. North of it the slab dips at 20 to 30, and Colombia does not. You can see this on a map without knowing any of the underlying physics, and once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. Trace the volcanoes of the Andes northward from Ecuador into Colombia, and they come in a reasonably orderly procession up the Cordillera Central. Then, at a certain latitude, they stop. Not thin out. Stop. Above that line there are old, eroded, long-dead volcanic rocks, and nothing that has erupted within a timescale anybody would call recent. The chain resumes far to the north in Central America, on the other side of the Panama collision, but in between there is a gap in the Andean arc that has no obvious explanation if you assume the plate below is a single continuous sheet. The gap is the tear, drawn at the surface in the presence and absence of volcanoes. One structure, two hazards. The published literature states it directly. The Caldas tear is controlling strong motion earthquakes and the quaternary volcanism of the northern Andes. It decides where the country's damaging deep earthquakes happen, and it decides where the country's volcanoes are allowed to exist. Before we leave the subject of Colombia's underground strangeness, there is one more thing worth mentioning in passing, because it establishes that Monday was not an aberration. In the northeast of the country, beneath the region around the city of Bucaramanga, there is a volume of rock that produces one of the densest concentrations of intermediate depth earthquakes anywhere on the planet. It is known as the Bucaramanga Nest. It sits at around 150 kilometers depth, and it is astonishingly localized. Thousands of earthquakes, year after year, packed into a small volume of mantle in a way that no other place on Earth quite matches. A 2023 study proposed lithospheric delamination as the driver, the dense lower portion of the continental plate peeling away from the crust above it and sinking, with the earthquakes marking the tearing edge. That is a different mechanism from the Caldas tear and a different part of the country, but it makes the same point. Colombia's defining earthquake hazard is not the shallow megathrust that most people picture when they think of the Ring of Fire. It is deep. It is inside the plates rather than between them, and it is structurally very strange. Monday's earthquake was an expression of that strangeness, so in the most literal sense is every volcano in the country, which means that if the tier decides where the volcanoes are, then there is a second half to this story sitting 285 kilometers south of Monday's epicenter, and 9 days before the earthquake it changed status. Part 11. Puracé At Orange. On the 1st of August 2026, 9 days before the earthquake, Colombia's Servicio Geológico Colombiano raised the alert level on a volcano called Puracé from yellow to orange. Puracé is not an obscure feature. It is one of the most persistently active volcanoes in Colombia, a stratovolcano sitting at over 4,000 meters in the Cordillera Central, inside a national park, surrounded by Páramo, the high, cold, sponge-like Andean grassland that supplies drinking water to a large part of the region. There are communities on its flanks, and the city of Popayán, with a population of several 100,000, lies within sight of it. This is not a remote peak that nobody would notice erupting. It sits in Cauca department, in the southwest of the country, at roughly 2.31 degrees north and 76.39 degrees west. Hold those coordinates for a second and compare them to Monday's epicenter. 4.88 degrees north, 76.21 degrees west. The longitudes are almost identical, 76.39 against 76.21, a difference of less than 20 kilometers east to west. The two locations sit, for practical purposes, on the same line drawn down the map of Colombia, and they are separated by about 285 kilometers, almost directly north to south. Both of them are south of the Caldas tear. Both of them sit above the steeply dipping southern segment of the Nazca Plate. The earthquake happened inside that slab. The volcano is fed by it. Same plate, same segment, same side of the tear, one line of longitude, and 9 days apart. Let us go through what actually changed at Puracé, because the detail matters and because the monitoring here is genuinely good. The observatory responsible is the Observatorio Vulcanologico y Sismologico de Popayán, the volcanological and seismological observatory at Popayán, the nearest city of any size. Beginning on the 20th of July, that observatory started recording persistent changes across multiple monitored parameters, not one anomalous reading, a sustained shift across several independent lines of evidence at once, which is precisely the pattern that makes volcanologists uncomfortable. The principal driver was seismic. The observatory recorded an increase in the seismic energy of earthquakes located approximately 1 kilometre below the crater. 1 kilometre. That is very shallow, and in volcano monitoring, shallow means close to the surface in the most literal and consequential sense. Earthquakes at that depth beneath a crater are not tectonic events in any ordinary sense. They are the sound of a system moving, fluids forcing their way through fractures, rock cracking as pressure builds, conduits being cleared, and it was not simply that there were more of them, it was that the energy they carried was rising. Alongside the seismicity, two other parameters moved in the same direction. The temperature of the ash emissions was rising, and the volume of gas being released into the atmosphere was increasing. Those three things together, more energetic shallow earthquakes, hotter emissions, more gas, form a coherent story rather than three coincidences. They are consistent with a body of magma or magmatic fluid at depth, becoming more active, driving heat and volatiles upward through the system. This is worth understanding as a mechanism, because it explains why volcanologists weight these three signals so heavily. Magma is not simply molten rock. It is molten rock with gas dissolved in it, held in solution by pressure the way carbon dioxide is held in an unopened bottle. As magma rises, the pressure confining it drops, and the dissolved gas comes out of solution and forms bubbles. Those bubbles expand. The expansion drives the magma upward faster, which drops the pressure further, which releases more gas. It is a feedback loop, and in its runaway form it is precisely what an explosive eruption is. So when an observatory sees gas output climbing, it is watching that process begin. When it sees emission temperatures rising, it is watching hotter material arrive closer to the surface. And when it sees the seismic energy of shallow earthquakes increasing, it is listening to rock fracturing as something forces a path through it. Any one of those alone could have another explanation. Weather affects gas measurements. Rainfall interacting with a hot system produces its own seismicity. All three moving together, sustained over days and then weeks, is much harder to explain as anything other than what it appears to be. The visible expression of it was substantial. Since the 20th of July, Puracé has been producing gas and ash columns reaching up to 3,400 metres above the summit. That is a column more than 3 kilometres tall. The estimated temperature of the material in those emissions has been around 140 degrees Celsius, and here is the figure that puts the whole thing in context. The emissions have been running at their highest level since 1993. 33 years. Puracé has not behaved like this in more than 3 decades. That assessment is not a Colombian outlier either. The Smithsonian Institution's Global Volcanism Program, which compiles weekly reports on volcanic activity worldwide from the observatories that monitor each system, independently documented the same picture: increases in the intensity of continuous tremor at Puracé, signals indicating ash emissions, gas and ash emissions rising as high as 3.4 kilometres above the crater rim, and ejector temperatures as high as 140 degrees Celsius, with the activity beginning to increase on the 20th of July and continuing to intensify from there. 2 independent institutions, the same numbers, the same trend. So on the 1st of August, the Servicio Geológico Colombiano moved the alert level up a notch, from yellow to orange. Now, what does orange actually mean? Because this is where public understanding of volcano alerts tends to go badly wrong in both directions. Orange, in the Colombian system, means that the probability of an eruption is now greater. That is the entire content of the statement. It is a probability revised upward. It does not mean an eruption is going to happen. It does not mean an eruption is imminent. It does not mean the observatory knows something it is not saying. Volcanoes go to orange and then quietly stand down again all the time, all over the world, and that is not a failure of the alert system. That is the alert system working exactly as designed. The purpose of an alert level is not to predict. It is to communicate the current state of a system and to move preparation forward in proportion to how uncertain that state has become. At the start of this month, we spent 2 consecutive videos on an Italian caldera underneath a city of 1 million people, where an earthquake broke the instrumental record and the alert level did not change at all. The lesson there was the mirror image of this one, and it is the same lesson. Alert levels are statements about probability and monitoring posture, not forecasts of events. A record-breaking earthquake with no level change was not the authorities being complacent. An orange alert with no eruption is not the authorities crying wolf. Both are what honest uncertainty looks like when it is written down and published. What orange does mean, practically, is that people are told not to approach the volcano, that the monitoring cadence increases, and that the machinery of local emergency preparation starts turning over rather than sitting idle. So that is the second half of the picture, and now the 2 halves are on the table together. On the 20th of July, a volcano in southern Colombia began behaving in a way it had not behaved since 1993. On the 1st of August, it was moved to the second highest alert level in the national system, and on the 10th of August, 285 kilometers to the north, on the same line of longitude, above the same steeply descending slab, on the same side of the same tear, the plate underneath the country broke and killed 20 people. The tear that put Monday's rupture at 107 kilometers is the same tear that allows Puracé to exist at all. Without that steep southern dip, there is no arc, no magma, no volcano, and nothing to raise an alert level on. 1 structure, 2 hazards, both active in the same fortnight, which raises the question that every single person watching has already asked, and which deserves a proper answer rather than a dismissive one. Are they connected? Part 12. 1 plate, 2 hazards. Let me make the case for a connection as strongly as it can honestly be made, and then let me take it apart. The case is this. Both the earthquake and the volcanic unrest are products of the same descending slab of the Nazca Plate. Both sit on the same steeply dipping southern segment, south of the same tear. They are separated by less than 20 kilometers of longitude and occurred within 9 days of each other. And critically, this is the part that makes the theory respectable rather than silly, there is a real, documented, peer-reviewed phenomenon in which large earthquakes measurably alter the behavior of volcanic systems. It is not fringe science, it is a genuine area of active research, and it has produced clear cases, so the intuition is not stupid. Anybody looking at those 2 facts side by side and wondering whether one has something to do with the other is thinking in exactly the right general direction. Now here is why the strong version does not survive contact with the details. The first problem is chronology, and it is close to fatal on its own. Puracé's parameters began changing on the 20th of July. The earthquake happened on the 10th of August. That is 21 days later, 3 full weeks. Whatever started the volcano moving, it was not the earthquake, because the volcano started moving 3 weeks before the earthquake existed. The sequence runs backwards for that particular causal story. The second problem is distance. 285 kilometers is very far indeed for stress transfer to do meaningful work. When a fault ruptures, it permanently redistributes stress in the surrounding crust, raising the probability of failure in some places and lowering it in others. That effect is real and measurable, and it is also local. It falls off extremely rapidly with distance. The general rule of thumb is that it becomes negligible beyond roughly 1 to 2 rupture lengths, which for an event of this size means tens of kilometers, not hundreds. At 285 kilometers, the permanent stress change delivered to Puracé's magma system by Monday's earthquake is, in engineering terms, nothing at all. The third problem is depth, and it is the one that gets overlooked. Monday's rupture was 107 kilometers down, inside a descending oceanic plate. Puracé's restlessness is concentrated 1 kilometer below its crater. Those 2 things are separated vertically by more than 100 kilometers of mantle wedge and continental crust. They are not in the same neighborhood. They are barely in the same system, other than in the very general sense that the slab ultimately supplies both the stress and the magma. So when volcanic modulation by earthquakes does genuinely occur, what does it look like? It looks like short range rather than long. It looks prompt rather than delayed. The effect, where it appears, tends to show up as the waves pass or in the hours and days immediately after, not weeks later. And it shows up most often in systems that were already restless and already close to some threshold, and in geothermal fields where fluids and pressures are delicately balanced. The honest verdict is therefore this: shared driver, not causation. The earthquake did not cause the volcanic unrest, and the volcanic unrest did not cause the earthquake. Both are what a torn, steeply descending slab of ancient seafloor does to the country sitting above it, expressed in two different ways at two different points along the same arc, and I want to be clear that this is not a deflating answer, it is a bigger answer. Two unrelated things happened would be deflating. What is actually true is that one geological structure is simultaneously generating lethal deep earthquakes at its northern end and feeding an awakening volcano at its southern end, and it has been doing this for millions of years, and it will keep doing it long after everyone watching this is gone. That is not less interesting than a direct causal link, it is considerably more. There is also a practical reason to care about getting this distinction right, and it is not merely intellectual hygiene. If you believe the earthquake caused the volcanic unrest, then your natural conclusion is that the danger at Puracé is new, that it began on Monday, and that it will fade as the aftershocks fade. Every part of that is wrong. The unrest began 3 weeks earlier, it is being driven by something inside the volcano rather than by anything that happened in Choco, and it will resolve on its own schedule, which has nothing to do with the earthquakes. Believing in a false cause does not just leave you with an incorrect model, it leaves you watching the wrong clock. There is one version of the question that remains genuinely open, though, and it is worth stating precisely because it is the thing actually worth watching. Puracé was already restless. It was already at orange. Its emissions were already at a 33-year high, and on Monday, a very large volume of seismic energy passed through the region as those waves propagated south. Does an already perturbed system, sitting at an elevated state, behave any differently in the days after being shaken? That is a real question with a near-term answer, and the answer will arrive in the observatory's next bulletins rather than from anybody's speculation. It is the single most concrete thing to watch coming out of this week. Now, while we are dealing with causation claims, there is a second one circulating that deserves the same treatment, because it is the most credible-sounding theory attached to this earthquake, and it involves a genuine tragedy. On the 24th of June, 2026, twin earthquakes of magnitude 7.2 and 7.5 struck Venezuela. By early August, the death toll had passed 6,000 people. More than 1,400 aftershocks had been recorded. And on Monday morning, when Colombia's rupture arrived, rescue and recovery teams were still actively working in Venezuela. 47 days apart, same corner of the same continent, both enormous. You can see why people connected them, and once again, the underlying physics is real. Static stress transfer is a genuine measurable effect. Dynamic triggering, where the passing seismic waves themselves nudge a distant fault into failure, is also genuine, and it has been documented at surprising distances, particularly in volcanic and geothermal settings. But apply the same three tests. Distance. Static stress transfer falls off within roughly 1 to 2 rupture lengths. Venezuela and Western Colombia are separated by a very great deal more than that, across structurally distinct parts of the boundary system. Timing. Dynamic triggering is essentially instantaneous. It happens while the waves are passing through or within hours. It does not wait 7 weeks and then act. Setting. The Venezuelan events were crustal, shallow ruptures in the upper plate. Monday's was intraslab, 107 kilometers down, inside a descending oceanic plate on a different part of the margin entirely. These are not the same system communicating with itself. They are two different systems that happen to share a continent. So the same verdict applies, for the same reasons. Both events are products of the same broad tectonic engine, the ongoing convergence that is building the northern Andes and has been for tens of millions of years. That engine produces earthquakes in Venezuela, and it produces earthquakes in Colombia, and it will produce more of both. Shared cause is not one causing the other. It is worth learning that distinction properly, because it is the difference between understanding a system and pattern matching on a map. And the distinction has a cost when people get it wrong, which is why I keep insisting on it. If you believe that a major earthquake in one country triggers major earthquakes in the next one along, then the reasonable conclusion after Venezuela was that Colombia was next, and the reasonable conclusion after Colombia is that Ecuador or Peru is next, and you will spend the coming weeks in a state of anticipatory dread waiting for a shoe that is not attached to the foot you are watching. The real situation is both less predictable and less frightening in that particular way. The northern Andes will produce more large earthquakes. They will do so on their own schedule, driven by strain that has been accumulating for centuries, and the timing of one has essentially nothing to tell you about the timing of the next one several hundred kilometers away. What is genuinely worth watching, out of everything in this section, is narrow and specific. Whether an already restless volcano at an elevated alert level shows any measurable change in the days following a magnitude 7.4 in the same slab. The observatory's next bulletin is where that answer lives. Part 13. What they're saying. Online. Within hours of any large earthquake in Latin America, a very consistent set of explanations begins circulating. I want to go through them properly rather than waving them away, because the people asking these questions are not being unreasonable. They are looking at something enormous and frightening and trying to find a cause proportional to it. That is a normal human response. It just happens, in this case, that the real answer is stranger than any of the alternatives. The first claim is that the earthquake was artificial, engineered, triggered deliberately by some form of technology, whether that is described as an ionospheric heater, a directed energy system, or an underground detonation. Here is the arithmetic that ends that conversation. A magnitude 7.4 releases an amount of energy that is difficult to convey in ordinary units. It is comparable to the yield of a very large thermonuclear device, not a warhead, a device, released not as a point explosion but distributed across a rupture surface many kilometers across, deep inside the Earth. There is no technology on this planet, classified or otherwise, capable of delivering that quantity of energy into rock. There is no power source available for it. There is no delivery mechanism. And then there is the depth, which finishes the argument on its own. The rupture happened 107 kilometers below the surface. The deepest hole human beings have ever drilled, a Soviet scientific borehole that took roughly 2 decades of continuous effort, reached about 12 kilometers before the rock became too hot and too plastic to continue. 12. We have never physically reached even a fifth of the way down to where this earthquake happened in all of human history, with unlimited time and a national scientific program behind the attempt. Meanwhile, the conventional explanation, a torn slab of ancient seafloor descending under a continent, accumulating stress and releasing it, is not a hypothesis somebody invented on Monday to explain this away. It has been documented in the peer-reviewed literature for decades. It predicted the depth range and the location of this event before it happened, and it explains thousands of other earthquakes in the same volume of rock. The second claim is fracking, or mining, or some other industrial activity. This one I want to treat more carefully, because unlike the first, it is grounded in something true. Induced seismicity is real. Human activity genuinely does cause earthquakes. Fluid injection can and does trigger measurable events, and there are regions of the world where the seismic hazard has changed detectably because of industrial operations. That is established science, and it is taken seriously by regulators. But it operates in the shallowest few kilometers of the crust, because that is as far as injected fluids can reach and as far as the pressure changes propagate. The largest induced events are typically in the magnitude 4 to 5 range, occasionally higher in unusual circumstances, and they happen in the upper crust. Monday's rupture was roughly 20 times deeper than the deepest plausible reach of any industrial activity on Earth, inside a plate that is descending into the mantle. There is no pathway. It is not that it is unlikely, it is that the mechanism does not exist. The third claim is that the death toll is being concealed, that the real number is far higher than 20, and that authorities are suppressing it. This one deserves the most patience, because the underlying observation is correct. There genuinely is a gap. The Geological Survey's own model gave roughly a 1 in 3 probability that this earthquake killed more than 1,000 people, and the confirmed figure at the end of the first day was around 20. That is a large discrepancy, and it is reasonable to notice it. But look at what explains it, because the real explanation is more troubling than a cover-up. Choco has very limited paved road access. The department is dense Andean and Pacific rainforest, cut by rivers, and a great many of its communities are reachable only by boat or light aircraft. The survey flagged landslides across a significant area, with a significant population exposed, and those landslides will have come down onto exactly the handful of routes that do exist, potentially before any assessment team travelled them. The airport at Quibdó, the departmental capital, had its operations suspended, and the buildings in the most heavily shaken zone are, by the survey's own classification, mud wall with wood. Put that together and the situation is not that somebody knows a number and is hiding it. It is that nobody knows the number, because nobody has physically been there yet. And there is one detail that settles the question of intent. The 1 in 3 estimate of more than 1,000 deaths was published by the Geological Survey itself in its public products within an hour of the earthquake. An agency engaged in concealing a death toll does not open by publishing a model that says the toll might exceed 1,000. That is the opposite of concealment. That is an institution telling you, in advance and in public, that the number you are about to see is probably too low. The fourth claim is the broadest one, that earthquakes are becoming more frequent, that the planet is entering some period of increased seismic activity, that this is part of a pattern. The data on this is unusually clean, and it comes from the same week. In the 7 days leading up to Monday, the global count of earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater stood at 101. In the previous 7-day window, it had been 98 to 101. That is not an increase in any meaningful sense. That is ordinary variation in a number that bounces around week to week. The planet was not shaking more in the run-up to Monday. It was shaking exactly as much as it always does. What changed was not the frequency. It was the maximum. The largest earthquake in the previous week had been a magnitude 5.6. This week it was a 7.4, and as we established earlier, that single change represents something like 500 times more energy in one event. One earthquake got bigger. The planet did not get busier. The reason it feels like earthquakes are increasing is that our ability to detect and report them has improved beyond recognition. There are more seismometers than at any point in history. They are more sensitive, the data moves faster, and an earthquake in a remote part of the world reaches a phone in another hemisphere within minutes. A magnitude 5 in an unpopulated region in 1960 would have been recorded by a handful of stations and noticed by almost nobody. Today, it generates an automated alert, a map, and a push notification. The signal changed. The Earth did not. Which brings me back to where this section started. Every one of these theories is an attempt to find a cause large enough to match the effect. And the actual cause is enormous. It is a slab of ocean floor, hundreds of kilometers wide, torn in half by the collision of a fragment of ancient volcanic islands that refused to sink, descending into the mantle at 2 different angles on either side of the rip, generating earthquakes at 100 kilometers depth in one place, and feeding volcanoes 285 kilometers away in another. Nobody built that. Nobody triggered it. And it is far more unsettling than anything anybody has posted about it, because there is no one to hold responsible and no way to switch it off. Part 14. The fault that is still shallow. There is one more thing to say about the number 20, and then one more thing to say about Colombia. The gap between 20 confirmed deaths and a modelled 1,000 is not a contradiction, and it is not evidence that the model was wrong. It is a measurement of how much of Colombia nobody had reached. Choco is one of the country's most biodiverse departments and one of its most economically marginalised. It receives some of the highest rainfall of anywhere on Earth. Its terrain is dense rainforest on both the Andean and Pacific sides. Large portions of it have no paved road at all, and for many communities the practical connection to the rest of the country is a river. Now layer the Geological Survey's 2 secondary hazard assessments on top of that geography. The first is liquefaction, which the survey assessed as affecting an extensive area, with an extensive population exposed. Liquefaction is what happens when saturated soil is shaken hard enough that the water between the soil grains takes the load instead of the grains themselves. For a period of seconds to minutes, ground that was solid behaves like a dense liquid. Foundations sink into it. Buildings tilt, sometimes without a single crack in the walls, because the structure has not failed. The ground underneath it has simply stopped being ground. Buried infrastructure suffers worst of all. Water mains, sewers, and pipelines rupture or float upward, and roads that looked intact from the air turn out to have failed underneath. Choco is close to a worse case for this. Persistent, extraordinary rainfall means the soils there are not occasionally saturated. They are saturated as a permanent condition. The second hazard is landslides, which the survey assessed as affecting a significant area, with a significant population exposed. Steep Andean slopes, permanently wet ground, and 100 seconds of long-period shaking is a straightforwardly bad combination. And the operational consequence of that is the grim one. The slides came down onto the few roads that exist, which means the access problem was not merely pre-existing. It was actively made worse by the earthquake at the exact moment it mattered most. Then there are the aftershocks. The magnitude 5.0 at 18 minutes past 1, universal time. 44 minutes after the main shock, 16 kilometres west of the epicentral town, 98.5 kilometres down. The separate magnitude 4.6. In absolute terms, these are small. The main shock released something on the order of 4,000 times the energy of that magnitude 5.0. But absolute terms are not what matters to a building that has already been cracked open, or to a slope that has already been shaken loose, or to a rescue worker standing inside a partially collapsed structure. Aftershocks do not need to be impressive. They only need to arrive at the wrong moment. So the 20 is a first-day count from the places you can drive to. It will move. By the time you watch this, it may have moved a great deal. And I want to name what that actually means, rather than leaving it as an abstraction about data collection. Somewhere in Choco tonight there are villages of a few hundred people, built of packed earth and timber, on saturated ground, at the bottom of slopes that have just been shaken for the better part of 2 minutes. Some of them will be fine. Some of them will have lost buildings. In a few, the road out may no longer exist. Nobody in Bogota knows which is which, and nobody will know until somebody physically arrives, by river, by helicopter, or on foot. That is not a failure of the Colombian state particularly. It is the geography of a department that has never been easy to reach on its best day, meeting an earthquake on one of its worst. Before the last thought, one final piece of perspective on depth, because Monday sat at the shallow end of a very strange spectrum. Within the same 24 hours as the Colombian earthquake, 3 other events occurred on the far side of the planet that make 107 kilometres look almost superficial. A magnitude 4.8 near Vanuatu at 655.7 kilometres depth. A magnitude 4.7 in the same region at 640.5 kilometres. And a magnitude 4.5 south of the Fiji Islands at 525.5 kilometres, 655 kilometres, more than 6 times deeper than Monday's rupture, and roughly 2/3 of the way to the deepest earthquakes ever recorded anywhere. And here is the thing about those. Nobody fully understands why they are possible. At those pressures and temperatures, rock is not supposed to break. Brittle failure, the snapping that produces an ordinary earthquake, requires material that can build up elastic strain and then fracture. Squeeze rock hard enough and heat it enough and it stops doing that. It flows instead, deforming plastically like extremely stiff toffee. By every straightforward calculation, earthquakes should become impossible somewhere around 50 or 60 kilometres down. They do not. They continue to 600 or 700, and after more than a century of investigation the mechanism remains genuinely contested. There are candidate explanations, mineral phase transformations that release fluid or cause sudden volume changes, runaway thermal instabilities in narrow shear zones, and none of them is settled. So here is where we have arrived. Depth decided who lived in Colombia on Monday, and we still do not entirely understand why earthquakes at depth are physically possible at all. Which brings me to the last thing, and it is not a comfortable one. Everything about Monday that reads as good fortune traces back to 107 kilometres of rock. Not to preparation, not to codes, not to warning, to distance, and specifically to vertical distance, which is the one form of protection nobody can engineer and nobody can rely on. Because that depth is not a permanent feature of Colombian seismic hazard. It was a property of one earthquake. Underneath the Coffee region, underneath Pereira, underneath Manizales, underneath Armenia, underneath the cities that took Monday's damage and buried Monday's dead, runs the Romeral fault system. It is crustal, it is shallow, and it is the system that produced the 1999 earthquake, 17 kilometres down, which killed 1,185 people and took 60% of Armenia's buildings. The Romeral system is not a single fault, but a belt of them, running roughly north to south along the western flank of the Central Cordillera for hundreds of kilometres, an ancient suture marking where fragments of oceanic crust were welded onto the edge of South America long before the current subduction geometry existed. It is one of the fundamental structural boundaries of the country, and because the Coffee region grew up along that same corridor, the cities and the fault belt occupy the same ground. Armenia, Pereira and Manizales did not spread out across a plain and happened to encounter a fault. They developed in the valleys and on the ridges that the fault system itself helped create. That system did not go anywhere. It has been accumulating strain every day since, including today, including while you have been watching this. And Monday told us something specific about those cities that is worth stating plainly. When filtered, long-period energy arrived from 100 kilometres away. An airport terminal roof came down, a 4-storey building partially collapsed, and 20 structures failed in Cali. That is what the current building stock does with the gentle version. The mountain of rock was not protection. It was distance, and distance is not a policy. Which leaves the question that everything in this video eventually points back to, and that nobody can answer yet. The agencies still do not agree on this earthquake. The Geological Survey says 107 kilometres. Colombia's own Geological Service says 96. The European Centre says 95, and puts the magnitude 2/10 lower. The focal mechanism allows 2 entirely different faults, one trending northeast and moving left laterally, one trending northwest and moving right laterally, and the data as it stands cannot distinguish between them. Over the coming weeks, as the aftershocks are relocated and the moment tensor is refined, those numbers will converge and one of those 2 faults will be ruled out. And when that happens, we will finally know whether this rupture occurred inside the torn southern segment near the Caldas boundary, exactly where the framework predicts it should have, or somewhere the framework did not anticipate. Until then, here is where we actually stand. 20 people are confirmed dead in Colombia, in a country where the real figure is still sitting in villages nobody has reached, and nobody can yet tell you which half of a broken plate killed them.